In the spring of 1853, on the Hartwell plantation in Fauquier County, Virginia, a 12-year-old white boy named William Hartwell asked his father why the enslaved man called Ruth slept on the floor outside his bedroom door, instead of in the quarters with the other house servants. His father explained that Ruth had been his wet nurse since birth and remained assigned to his care as a matter of household protocol, a response that prompted William to ask what a wet nurse was and why he required one when his mother lived in the same house. Within 6 months, Ruth would be sold to a cotton broker from Mississippi. William's mother would refuse to speak her son's name in the presence of guests, and the Hartwell family Bible would be altered to remove all references to William's birth date and early childhood. This story asks one question: when love is built on ownership and care is extracted through force, what remains when the child learns the truth? Subscribe to the Bondage Chronicles for stories buried by those who benefited from their silence. Now let's return to where it began. Ruth was folding linens in the upstairs hallway when William approached her with the question, his footsteps audible on the wooden floor long before he spoke, giving her time to arrange her face into the expression of patient attention that had become automatic over 12 years. She set down the pillowcase she was holding and waited for him to finish his question, why she slept on the pallet outside his room, rather than in the servants' quarters behind the kitchen house. The question itself was not unusual. William asked questions constantly, about everything from why horses needed shoes to how clocks measured hours. But this particular question carried a weight that made her hands still completely for the first time since he had entered the hallway. She answered that his father had assigned her near his room when he was an infant to ensure someone could respond if he woke during the night, and that the arrangement had continued as he grew older, because the household routines once established unless the master ordered otherwise. William accepted this explanation and returned to his studies in the library, leaving Ruth alone with the unfolded linens and the knowledge that his curiosity about household arrangements had shifted from abstract to specific questioning about her position within those arrangements. She resumed folding, her hands moving through the practiced motions, while her mind assessed whether this conversation would be reported to anyone and what consequences might follow if it was. The library door remained closed for the next hour, and Ruth completed her work in the upstairs rooms before descending to the kitchen house, where 3 other enslaved women were preparing the midday meal for the family. The cook, an older woman named Esther who had worked in the Hartwell kitchen for 26 years, asked whether William had been difficult that morning, and Ruth said he'd asked about sleeping arrangements in the main house. Esther stopped cutting vegetables and looked at Ruth directly, her expression communicating a warning that needed no words. She said that questions about household assignments sometimes indicated that white children were beginning to understand the structure of authority on the plantation, and that this awareness changed relationships in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. Ruth said she understood and asked whether Esther needed help with the meal preparation. Esther handed her a knife and a basket of potatoes without further comment. William did not mention Ruth's sleeping location again for 3 days, but his behavior during those days showed subtle changes that Ruth recognized as significant, even though she could not yet determine what they meant. He stopped asking her to sit with him while he practiced reading, a routine they had maintained since he was 7 years old. He no longer called for her immediately upon waking, instead dressing himself and coming downstairs without requesting her assistance. He spoke to her only when necessary and did not initiate conversations about topics that interested him, breaking a pattern of constant questions and observations that had characterized his behavior for years. Ruth mentioned none of these changes to anyone, because speaking about them would require acknowledging that they mattered, and acknowledging that they mattered would require explaining why a white child's reduced attention to an enslaved woman constituted a problem worth discussing. On Thursday evening, Williams followed Ruth into his study after supper and asked whether she had said anything to William about her duties when he was younger. Ruth said she had answered his question about where she slept but had provided no additional information beyond what he specifically asked. Master Hartwell said that William had been asking his mother questions about infants and feeding, questions that suggested he was trying to understand, without directly stating what he wanted to know. He said that Ruth was to avoid any conversation with William about her previous duties, and was to inform him immediately if William continued asking questions on related topics. Ruth said she understood and would comply with these instructions. Master Hartwell dismissed her, without explaining why William's question concerned him, or what consequences he anticipated if the questions continued. The household staff included 12 enslaved people who lived in the quarters behind the main house, plus Ruth, who slept on a pallet in the upstairs hallway. This arrangement had existed since William's birth in 1841. When Ruth was brought from the field quarters to the main house 3 weeks after delivering her own child, a daughter who remained in the field quarters under the care of other enslaved women, while Ruth moved into the position of wet nurse. The transition had been presented as a promotion, a move from brutal field labor to the supposed easier work of caring for an infant in the relative comfort of the main house. Ruth had never been asked whether she wanted this position, and the infant daughter she left behind had been sold to a neighboring plantation when she was 14 months old, an event learned about 2 days after it occurred when she asked a field hand if he had seen her daughter that week. William's mother, Margaret Hartwell, maintained minimal direct contact with enslaved household staff, preferring to communicate her requirements through husband or through written notes left in the kitchen house. She had never spoken to Ruth about William's infancy or about Ruth's role during those years, and Ruth had never been present at conversations between Margaret and other white women who visited the plantation. The social structure of the household required Ruth to be simultaneously indispensable to William's daily life and invisible to his mother's social world. A contradiction managed through careful spatial and temporal separation that kept Ruth in the upstairs hallway when guests occupied the downstairs rooms, and kept her silent when family conversations occurred in spaces where she was required to be present. Ruth had been 21 years old when she became William's wet nurse, and she was 33, having spent more than a third of her life in immediate proximity to this child who called her by name, but never questioned why she could not sit at the table when he ate, or why she disappeared into the upstairs hallway when his parents hosted evening gatherings. The 12 years had created a relationship that resembled maternal care in its daily routines and physical intimacy, but differed fundamentally in the power structure that governed every interaction. William had never been taught to say please or thank you to Ruth because enslaved did not require such courtesies, and Ruth had never been permitted to correct Williams directly because discipline of white children was the exclusive right of white adults, even when those adults were absent and the child's behavior created immediate danger. William's questions about infants and feeding continued, despite his father's prohibition against such discussions with Ruth. He began spending time in the plantation library reading medical texts and agricultural manuals that contained information about animal husbandry and human physiology, books he had previously ignored in favor of adventure novels and history texts. Ruth became aware of this shift in his reading habits when she cleaned his room and found medical volumes left open on his desk, describing maternal nursing practices in various cultures and time periods. She reported this observation to Master Hartwell as instructed, and he responded by removing the medical texts from the library and restricting William's access to any books that discussed human reproduction or infant care. The restriction provoked the first serious argument between William and his father that Ruth had witnessed in 12 years. She was in the upstairs hallway when William's raised voice carried from the study downstairs. His were indistinct, but his clearly communicating anger and frustration. Master Hartwell's response was quieter and impossible to hear clearly. But the conversation ended with William leaving the study and climbing the stairs to his room, his face showing an express seen before. Not anger exactly, but something older that suggested he had encountered a boundary that would not yield to his usual tactics of persistence and charm. He saw Ruth standing in the hallway with fresh linens and walked past her without acknowledgement, entering his room and closing the door firmly enough to communicate dismissal without crossing into outright rudeness that would require parental discipline. 3 days later, William approached Ruth in the kitchen house while she was helping prepare vegetables for the evening meal, a location where they were technically alone, but where any conversation could be overheard by staff working in adjacent rooms. He asked her directly how long she had taken care of him when he was an infant, and Ruth answered that she had been assigned to his care from his birth until he was weaned, approximately 2 years. William asked whether she had other duties during those years besides his care. Ruth said her only assignment was to tend to his needs as directed by his parents. William asked whether she had been permitted to care for her own children during that time, and Ruth set down the knife she was holding, and she needed to check on tasks in the main house, leaving the kitchen before William could ask additional questions that she could not answer without violating Master Hartwell's explicit instructions. Ruth reported the conversation to Master Hartwell within the hour, and he responded by summoning William to his study for a conversation that lasted approximately 30 minutes. When William emerged, his expression showed none of the anger from the previous confrontation, but instead a careful blankness that suggested he had learned something important and was working to conceal his reaction. He did not seek out Ruth for the remainder of that day or the following morning, but he began watching her with an attention that differed from his previous casual awareness, his eyes following her movements through rooms with the focused observation of someone cataloging details for future reference. On Saturday morning, Master Hartwell received a letter from his brother in Richmond requesting assistance with a property dispute that required testimony from someone familiar with land surveys conducted in Fouke County during the 1830s. The letter sat on his desk for 2 days before he mentioned it at the evening meal, noting that he would need to travel to Richmond for approximately 1 week and that Margaret would manage the household in his absence. William asked whether he could accompany his father to Richmond to visit his uncle's family, and Master Hartwell said the trip would involve legal proceedings rather than social visits, and was therefore not appropriate for William's attendance. The conversation moved to other topics, and the letter remained on the desk in the study until Master Hartwell departed for Richmond the following Thursday morning. Margaret Hartwell had never directly supervised household staff in her husband's absence, preferring to communicate requirements through written notes that were delivered by other enslaved people rather than through face-to-face conversations. This system worked adequately for routine household management, but created ambiguity about discipline and problem-solving when situations arose that required immediate decisions. William understood this limitation in his mother's authority and had learned over the years which requests would be granted automatically, which would be deferred until his father's return, and which would be refused regardless of their merit. Ruth understood the same dynamics but from a different position, knowing that Margaret's discomfort with direct supervision created opportunities for enslaved staff to exercise small degrees of autonomy that would be impossible under Master Hartwell's more attentive management. On the second day of his father's absence, William asked his mother at breakfast whether Ruth had other children besides him. phrasing the question as casual curiosity about Hold's staff rather than as a request for specific information about Ruth's history. Margaret's response was immediate and sharp, telling William that such questions were inappropriate and that he should not concern himself with the personal lives of enslaved people beyond what was necessary for household function. William apologized and said he had not intended to be inappropriate, but Ruth, who was serving the meal, saw his expression and recognized that the apology was procedural rather than sincere, a social gesture designed to end the conversation rather than to acknowledge genuine wrongdoing. After breakfast, William found Ruth in the up's hallway and told her directly that he knew she had been his wet nurse, and that this meant she had fed him from her own body when he was an infant. He said he had learned this information from the medical texts before they were removed from the library, and that he understood now why his father had reacted with such anger to his questions. He said he wanted to know whether she had been willing to serve in that capacity or whether she had been forced. And Ruth said she could not have this conversation with him because his father had forbidden it, and because any answer she gave would create problems she could not afford. William said he was asking her directly as a person rather than as property, and Ruth said that distinction was meaningless because she was legally both and could not choose, governed any particular interaction. William persisted, saying that he needed to understand whether his entire childhood had been built on a lie, and whether the woman who had cared for him for 12 years had done so willingly or under compulsion. Ruth said that willingness was not a category that applied to enslaved people's work, that everything she did was compulsory by definition, and that his question assumed a freedom of choice that had never existed. She said that she had fed him as an infant because she was ordered to do so, that she had cared for him for 12 years because those were her assigned duties, and that any affection he believed existed between them was constructed within a framework of absolute power imbalance that made genuine relationship impossible. William's face showed that he had not expected this answer, and he said he had always believed she cared for him because she chose to, not because she had no alternative. Ruth said that whether she cared for him personally was separate from whether she had any choice about serving as his caretaker, and that conflating the two questions was how white children convinced themselves that enslaved people's forced labor was actually a form of love. She said that she had performed her duties adequately because inadequate performance resulted in punishment, that she had learned to anticipate his needs, because failure to do created problems for both of them, and that any appearance of maternal affection was a strategy rather than an authentic emotional bond. William said this explanation made their entire relationship seem like a performance, and Ruth said that was exactly what it had been from the beginning, a carefully maintained performance that had protected her from the much worse alternatives available to enslaved women on Virginia plantations. The conversation ended when Margaret called for William from downstairs and returned to her tasks while William descended the stairs to respond to his mother's summons. Neither of them spoke to each other for the rest of that day, and Ruth used the evening hours to consider what consequences this exchange might produce when Master Hartwell returned from Richmond. She understood that William's questions represented a fundamental challenge to social order that governed the plantation, and that allowing such questions to continue would eventually white authorities to either provide answers that exposed the system's brutality or to punish the questioner for asking. Either outcome would be dangerous for everyone involved, particularly for Ruth, whose position depended on maintaining the fiction that her forced labor was a form of privileged service rather than a different category of exploitation. Master Hartwell returned from Richmond on the following Tuesday, and Margaret informed him immediately that William had been asking questions about Ruth's background and about nursing practices, despite the prohibition against such inquiries. Master Hartwell summoned William to the study and asked him directly what he hoped to accomplish by continuing to pursue information that had been explicitly forbidden. William said he believed he had a right to understand the circumstances of his own infancy and the nature of his relationship with the person who had cared for him during those years. Master Hartwell said that rights were determined by law and social custom, not by personal belief, and William's age and position did not grant him authority to question household arrangements established by his father. William said he understood that his father had authority over household decisions, but that this authority did not erase the moral questions raised by the use of enslaved women as wet nurses, particularly when those women were separated from their own children to provide care for white infants. Master Hartwell's expression changed from irritation to something colder, and he asked William where he had learned to frame questions in terms of moral philosophy rather than practical household management. William said he had reasoned it out himself after reading the medical texts and after speaking with Ruth about her duties. Master Hartwell asked what specifically Ruth had told him, and William said she had explained that her labor was compulsory and that any appearance of willing service was a survival strategy rather than authentic choice. Master Hartwell stood and walked to the study door, calling for the overseer, a white man named Sullivan who managed discipline for enslaved workers and handled tasks that required direct physical enforcement. When Sullivan arrived, Master Hartwell said that Ruth had violated explicit instructions by discussing her previous with William, and furthermore corrupted William's understanding of proper household relationships by introducing inappropriate concepts about the nature of enslaved labor. He said that Ruth would be reassigned to field work immediately and would receive 10 lashes as punishment for insubordination, a sentence to be carried out that evening after the field hands returned from the day's work. William said his father was punishing Ruth for his own questions, and that this was unjust because Ruth had only answered questions he had insisted she address. Master Hartwell said that justice was not relevant to the management of enslaved property, and that William's continued defense of Ruth's behavior demonstrated exactly why the correction was necessary. Ruth was taken to the quarters that afternoon and informed of the charges against her and the punishment that would be administered. She had been whipped twice before in her 12 years on the Hartwell plantation, once for breaking a serving dish when she was 15, and once for being late to her assigned duties when she was 26. Both previous whippings had been 5 lashes, enough to cause pain and demonstrate authority, but not enough to cause injury that would impair her ability to work. 10 lashes represented a more severe punishment, one that would require several days of recovery and would leave permanent scarring that would be visible to anyone who saw her back. The overseer administered the punishment at dusk in the area behind the quarters, where such corrections were typically conducted, with approximately 20 enslaved people present as witnesses, a standard practice designed to reinforce social control through public demonstration of authority. William was not present during the whipping, having been confined to his room by his father with instructions that he was not to leave the main house for any reason. Ruth was returned to the quarters after the punishment and provided with basic medical treatment by Esther, who cleaned the wounds and applied a salve made from rendered fat and herbs that reduce infection risk and promote healing. Ruth remained in the quarters for 3 days, unable to perform any work that required bending or lifting, before being assigned tasks in the kitchen house that she could complete while minimizing movement that would reopen the healing wounds. She was not returned to the main house or to her previous duties caring for William, and her pallet in the upstairs hallway was removed and given to another enslaved woman who was assigned to general housekeeping tasks. William attempted to visit Ruth in the quarters on the second day after her punishment, but he was prevented from doing so by Sullivan, who informed him that Master Hartwell had given explicit instructions that William was not permitted to communicate with Ruth under any circumstances. William said he only wanted to apologize for causing her punishment, and Sullivan said that enslaved people did not receive apologies from white family members. That William's continued focus on Ruth's situation was inappropriate and disturbing to the household's proper functioning. William returned to the main house and wrote a letter to Ruth, which he attempted to give to Esther to deliver. But Esther refused to accept it, saying that she would not participate in communications that violated Master Hartwell's direct orders. William burned the letter in the fireplace in his room, and Ruth learned of its existence only weeks later when Esther mentioned the incident in passing during a conversation about William's changed behavior. Master Hartwell informed William at supper 2 weeks after Ruth's punishment that arrangements had been made to sell Ruth to a cotton broker from Mississippi who was assembling a workforce for a newly acquired plantation in the Delta region. The sale would be completed within the month, and Ruth would depart with the broker's coffle when it left Virginia in early July. William said this sale was unnecessary and cruel, that Ruth had committed no offense that warranted permanent removal from the only home she had known for 12 years. Master Hartwell said that Ruth's sale had nothing to do with punishment and everything to do with household management, that her continued presence on the plantation created an unhealthy attachment that was preventing William from developing appropriate relationships with enslaved people based on authority rather than false intimacy. He said that William would understand this decision better as he matured and assumed responsibility for managing his own property and household. William did not respond to this explanation, and he did not speak to his father for the remainder of the meal or for several days afterward, a silence that Margaret attempted to address through gentle conversation about other topics, but William maintained despite her efforts. He asked his mother whether she had known that Ruth was his wet nurse when he was an infant, and Margaret said she had known but had not considered it information that William needed to possess. William asked whether she had known that Ruth had been separated from her own daughter to provide care for him, and Margaret said that such arrangements were standard practice on plantations throughout Virginia, that Ruth's daughter had been well cared for until her sale to a neighboring property. William asked why his mother had never mentioned any of this information, and Margaret said were not typically informed about the practical details of household management involving enslaved workers, because such information served no useful purpose and could create a kind of inappropriate emotional attachments that were now causing problems. Ruth was sold on July 3, 1853, for $850 to a broker named Clemens, who specialized in acquiring domestic slaves for transport to Deep South plantations where the cotton economy created constant demand for experienced workers. The sale was conducted in the plantation office with Master Hartwell and Clemens negotiating the price, while Ruth stood silently in the corner awaiting the conclusion of the transaction. Clemens examined Ruth briefly, checking her teeth and asking her age and work history, which Master Hartwell answered on her behalf using information from his plantation records. Ruth was not asked to speak, and she provided no information beyond what was specifically requested by Clemens through questions directed to Master Hartwell. The sale contract was signed and witnessed by Sullivan, and Ruth was informed she would depart with Clemens' coffle in 5 days when it left for the South. William learned of the completed sale when he overheard a conversation between his parents during which Margaret expressed relief that the situation was finally resolved and household routines could return to normal. He confronted his father again, saying that selling Ruth to a Mississippi cotton plantation was was effectively a death sentence given the mortality rates for enslaved workers in the Delta region, and that this punishment was grossly disproportionate to any offense Ruth had actually committed. Master Hartwell said that Ruth's sale was not punishment but sound business practice, that Ruth, 33 years old, and no longer suited for the light domestic work she had been performing, and that her value would decline rapidly over the next several years, unless she was transferred to more appropriate labor while she still commanded a reasonable price. He said that William's emotional reaction to this routine business transaction demonstrated exactly he needed to develop a more practical and less sentimental approach to property management. William said he wanted to purchase Ruth himself using the inheritance money that had been set aside for him in his grandmother's will, approximately $1,500, that was being held in trust until he reached legal majority at age 21. Master Hartwell said that trust funds could not be accessed for any purpose until William reached the age specified in the trust document, and that even if such acts were possible, using inheritance money to purchase enslaved property that William's father had already sold would constitute a direct challenge to parental authority that would not be tolerated. William said he would find another way to prevent the sale, and Master Hartwell said no such way existed because the sale was a legal transaction between two adults and had no standing to interfere with or contest its terms. William left the conversation without responding further, and he did not appear at the evening meal or speak to either parent for the next 2 days. On July 7th, the morning Ruth was scheduled to depart with Clemens Koffel, William left the main house before dawn and walked to the quarters where the enslaved workers bound for Mississippi were being assembled for the journey. He found Ruth among a group of 11 people who were being fitted with iron collars and chains that would connect them in a line for the 3-week walk to the Mississippi River, where they would board a steamboat for transport to the plantation that had purchased them. William approached Ruth directly and said he was sorry for everything that happened, that he had not understood the true nature of their relationship until it was too late to change anything, and that he would remember her always as the person who had cared for him when he was unable to care for himself. Ruth looked at him without expression and said that his memory would serve him better than it would serve her, and that whatever comfort he drew from remembering her kindness would not fact that his comfort had been built on her exploitation. William asked whether there was anything he could do to help her, and Ruth said that unless he possessed the to cancel the sale and free her from bondage entirely, his offers of help were meaningless gestures that served only to make him feel better about a situation he lacked the power or courage to change. She said that he was 12 years old and would someday be a man with the authority to own other human beings, or to refuse that authority, and that the choice he made when that time came would determine whether he became the kind of person who could live with himself, or the kind whose life constructing elaborate justifications for participating in an evil system. William said he would never own enslaved people, and Ruth said that such promises were easy to make at 12 and much harder to keep at when inheritance and social position and economic pressure made ownership seem like the only practical option available to men of his class. Clemens called for the coffle to begin moving, and Ruth was chained into position between 2 other enslaved people, a young man in front and an older woman behind. William stood watching as the line formed and began walking toward the road would take them out of Fauquier County and eventually to Mississippi. He remained standing there for several minutes after the coffle disappeared from view, and then he returned to the main house, where his father was breakfast and reading correspondence from Richmond. Master Hartwell asked whether William had been to the quarters to watch the departure, and William said he had gone to apologize to Ruth. Master Hartwell said that apologies to enslaved people were inappropriate, because they suggested equality in the relationship, and that William needed to learn to separate his personal feelings from his responsibilities as a member of a slave-holding family. William said nothing in response and left the room without eating. Ruth arrived in Mississippi in late July after a journey that killed 2 members of the coffle from dysentery and left several others, including Ruth, severely weakened from inadequate food and water during the 3-week walk. She was assigned to field work on a cotton plantation near Greenwood, where she worked for the next 12 years, until the end of the Civil War freed her, along with approximately 4 million other enslaved people across the South. She never saw William Hartwell again and never learned what became of him, or whether he kept his promise not to own enslaved people. The plantation where she worked kept minimal records of individual enslaved workers, and after emancipation most of those records were destroyed or lost, leaving no documentation of years in Mississippi beyond the brief mention of Clementis in Clan's ledger, which noted age 33 domestic sound. William Hartwell inherited his father's 1968 when Master Hartwell died of pneumonia at age 56. By that time, the Civil War had ended slavery throughout the South, and the Hartwell plantation had been seized temporarily by Union forces during the war, and returned to the family afterward under Reconstruction policies that required loyalty oaths and compliance with new labor laws. William operated the plantation using paid black workers under annual contracts, a system that differed from slavery in its legal structure, but often replicated many of the same power dynamics through debt, restricted mobility, and economic coercion. He married 870 and had 3 children, none of whom were told about Ruth or about the circumstances of William's infancy. He never publicly opposed slavery or publicly supported abolition, and his name does not appear in any anti-slavery documents or organizations from the period before or during the war. The Hartwell Family Bible, which had been altered to remove references to William's birth date and early childhood, was preserved through multiple generations and eventually donated to a historical society in Virginia in 1947. The alterations were documented by archivists who noted that several pages had been removed and the binding had been repaired at some point in the mid-19th century, suggesting that the family had deliberately erased portions of their own history. No explanation for these alterations was included with the donation, and no family member interviewed by the Historical Society could provide information about why the modifications had been made or what information had been removed. The Bible is currently housed in a climate-controlled archive and is available for researchers by appointment. Margaret Hartwell lived until 1881 and never publicly discussed Ruth or the events of 1853. Her personal correspondence, which was preserved after her death and is now held in the Virginia Historical Society collection, contains several letters to her sister in Richmond mentioning household disruptions during the early 1850s, but providing no specific details about their nature or resolution. One letter from June 1853 mentions that William been difficult recently and that Master Hartwell was managing the situation through methods Margaret preferred not to describe in writing. The letter concludes with a statement that the problem had been resolved satisfactorily, and that Margaret hoped William would mature past this phase of inappropriate attachments. The 1850 census for Fauquier County, Virginia, lists the Hartwell plantation as containing 43 enslaved people, identified in the census by age, gender, and color but not by name. The 1860 census shows 37 enslaved people on the property, a reduction attributable to deaths, sales, and one recorded escape attempt in 1857. Neither census includes any notation about the specific duties performed by individual enslaved workers, and no separate plantation records survive that would document Ruth's years of service as William Hartwell's wet nurse, or the circumstances of her sale in 1853. The historical record contains William's birth date, his marriage date, his death date 1891, and brief mentions of his service as county tax assessor from 1872 to 1875. It contains nothing about what he remembered, what he regretted, or whether he ever understood that Ruth had been right when she told him memory would serve him better than it would serve her.